So Tom Woolley will be familiar to many of you, I think. He's an architect and environmental researcher living in County Down in Northern Ireland, working with Rachel Bevan Architects. I think he's internationally known for his work on sustainability, construction and energy. And he has taught numerous places and given numerous CPD and learning experiences. I think at the moment he is consultant to ECOS, the European Environmental Citizens Organisation for Standards, and represents them on a range of EU sustainability standards working group. And Tom, I'm going to hand over to you now, and then we'll all come back together at the end and have questions for the whole of this session.
Okay, are you seeing my screen?
I am not seeing your screen.
Okay.
Somewhere we have Morgan, our tech angel.
Hang on, sorry. I think I might have not. I'm trying to click the share button, but nothing happens.
You have to click on the bit above that says share my screen and then click on the button, I think is the trick.
There's nothing I can click on to share my screen. I'm sorry.
That's right. Is the icon on the bottom, is that been blacked out, or can you click that still?
Which one? The screen one?
Yeah, that one.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and then where it says your entire screen, you can see us. You can see that image.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Click that, and then click the blue share button.
Ah, that's open the blue. There we go.
Amazing. All right.
All right.
You know. Yep. Your presentation's there. Go ahead.
Good. Fantastic. Okay. I'm going to try and whiz through some of this because I've got a bit of stuff about plastics here, and Lizzie's done such a good job on that. But I want to maybe try and broaden out the subject a bit, just because I'm working on a report about plastics in buildings at the moment. And one of the things that I've realized with the research that we've been doing is how active the chemical and plastic industry is in promoting the use of plastics. So that the increase of plastics in buildings is quite staggering. I think we're facing a battle with these people. I think we can try and do good things ourselves, but how do we stop these people promoting more and more of these chemical and plastic materials? So that's partly the focus of this talk. And as I say, Lizzie's covered this pretty well, so I don't really need to spend any time on this slide, other than the fact that the amount of plastics is just massive. But what is very clear is that increasingly buildings are being built using greater amounts of plastic and chemical materials. And even though they represent relatively small amount in terms of mass of the building, the emissions that they cause are huge. And we somehow, there's so much talk now about zero carbon buildings, which I'll come back to. And the assumption is the only way we're going to achieve this is by using more plastic materials. But those of you who've had the misfortune to follow any of the Grenfell inquiry will realize just how shocking the most recent revelations have been about how the plastic foam insulation companies have distorted the results of tests and made false claims about their materials. And that continues to go on. And I've had quite a lot of conversations with architects recently about this. So on the left of the slide, there's an interview, an anonymized interview with an architect. This is a real interview. And I asked this architect why he, and it was a man, didn't want to use natural materials, particularly for insulation. So the architect's response is, natural materials are too risky. We don't want to take any risks after Grenfell. So I said, what insulation do you prefer to use? Oh, we use Celotex or Kingspan. So I then said, but did you know that it was Celotex that was used on Grenfell? And the response was actually slightly less polite than I've put there. And I think I'm coming across more and more examples of architects moving towards the right. Patrick Schumacher, who's recently spoke at a conference, is talking about the dangers of people like ourselves who are demanding radical changes, and even talking about degrowth. I mean, obviously, the capitalist economy needs to grow, and anybody suggesting that is perhaps putting the wrong ideas forward. So we're trying to develop materials like clay, earth-based materials and so on, but we are really facing a big struggle in that 71% of global emissions are caused by a relatively small number of large companies, many of which, by the way, are the companies that produce building materials. And here are the main big companies that you can see. And if you haven't seen the film Dark Waters, you really ought to see it. A part of the problem is we're suffering from this fake news greenwash about zero, towards zero, zero carbon, net zero, nearly zero, decarbonisation. You hear it almost every day of the week. I've been analysing reports. I'm now on the 50th report, all of which have been produced in the last 2 years about how we're going to decarbonise. And none of them talk about the kinds of issues that we're talking about today. So we've got this big problem of fake zero. So I'm putting forward this suggestion that we should be talking about really zero. And I've got quite a few people have picked up on that already. Here's a really good example of fake zero greenwash. I've come across several images of these concrete high embodied impacts buildings, but because they've got plants growing out of them, this is being claimed to be zero carbon. It's quite funny that these blocks in China have not been occupied because they've become havens for mosquitoes. The other big problem we're facing is there is this assumption that the only way we can save the planet is through technological innovation. But that means that even more destruction to the environment. So here we see a lithium mine. Here's a Tesla car with a half-ton battery in it. That the battery production releases as much CO2 as 8 years of gasoline driving. So, I mean, we've got really big problems here with people who think that there are technological solutions. And yet, the vast majority of insulation which is used in buildings are destroying the planet. About 95% of all insulation in buildings is made using synthetic materials. And because of the pollution caused by these materials, a lot of the production has moved to China. So now we have CFC emissions in China. You can see this map on the right tracking the emissions of CFCs. CFCs were banned in 1992 under the Montreal Protocol, but we have people using them again now, causing enormous damage. And we also have this really serious problem with fire. There's a great deal of talk now about modern methods of construction, structural insulated panels. But the problem is that these buildings are very, very susceptible to fire. And there's been a number of shocking fires recently. In low-rise buildings, we're not talking about over 80 meters Grenfell type problems. We're talking about low-rise buildings that get burned to the ground very, very quickly because of the use of these flammable materials. The other big problem, which tends to get overlooked, though there's increasing interest in it now, is the problem of indoor air quality and the damage caused to people's health by the range of pollutants, volatile organic compounds and so on, that are increasingly released into buildings because of the use of plastic and synthetic materials. And this is something I go on about at great length, and I've written a book about as well, but I'm just trying to flag up the various issues and problems. Now, I'm concerned about what we just heard from Tim, because I'm afraid I wouldn't want to build buildings out of tires. And I've listed here the chemicals which are used in the production that will be found in tyres. It's quite a lengthy list of seriously toxic chemicals, and there is some research now which has confirmed that there is a release of various chemicals from tyres, even when they're used in buildings, in particular brominated flame retardants, which are meant to be being phased out, but are particularly serious in terms of their endocrine disruption effects. So personally, I wouldn't want to live in a building where I was surrounded by used tyres. There are some interesting initiatives going on. There's an amazing housing association in the Midlands that is building some so-called plastic-free homes. They actually don't claim them to be plastic-free. They say virtually plastic-free. So they're working hard to reduce the amount of plastics going into the building. And they are actually interested in using more natural materials. I wouldn't necessarily use all the materials that they're using, but I think they need to be congratulated that they're actually making an effort to do this, and we need to see far more organisations committing themselves to plastic-free construction. But we're still really stuck with this, what's become known as the Techno salvation problem. And there's some tremendous writing about this by a woman in the USA called Christine Mattis, in which she explains how many of the so-called Green New Deal and environmental policies that are being put forward depend on techno-salvation and depend on the use of materials which are both damaging the planet and also damaging the health and livelihood of people, particularly in less developed countries. The other big problem that we have is that we have what she calls the gatekeepers, and these are people who are promoting supposedly environmentally progressive ideas. One particular document I'm very critical of is Zero Carbon Britain, in which they are promoting a lot of techno-salvation solutions. There is a very, very tiny reference to using natural insulations in Zero Carbon Britain, but essentially it doesn't challenge the use of plastics and high-tech solutions, and that's what we need to be doing. Just recently I stumbled across my old copy of Radical Technology, which was produced in 1976 by Godfrey Boyle and Peter Harper, and Godfrey sadly is no longer with us, is involved in Zero Carbon Britain. But actually, if you look back at this document in 1976, it's actually far more radical and far more innovative in terms of its approach to alternative methods than the more recent stuff. So I'm not quite sure why we've gone backwards. So I'll just list very quickly the various techno-salvation problems we've got. So we've got the so-called Green New Deal. Labour Party, I'm involved there, but I'm very critical of what often gets called shovel-ready technology. In other words, we haven't got time to wait for all these nice utopian natural materials to come along. We have to keep using plastic, and that's a ready there's a common argument. There's a massive problem in the UK now with what's called the retrofit disaster problem, because people have been sticking plastic foam insulation onto houses, up to maybe 3 million houses affected by this. I spoke to somebody in Merseyside who's responsible for retrofit and Green New Deal policies, and he says that they don't have any money to retrofit houses now because they're having to spend it on repairing all the bodged up retrofit disaster problems. In Wales, there's some pretty worrying techno-salvation solutions, this idea of houses as powerhouses. And here you see an example of a project that's being built in Neath at the moment, where they're using PUR insulation, great thick slabs of the stuff, and then putting solar panels on both the roofs and the walls of the houses. I can come back to some of these if people want to ask more. many of the Green New Deal people are advocating putting solar panels on everybody's houses, but unfortunately, I've discovered recently that thousands and thousands of houses in the UK have been burned to the ground virtually due to faulty and bodged solar panels. Solar panels, I mean, I'm not against them. I have some myself, but the point is that if this is what they're going to do to people's houses, it's another bad techno salvation idea. And then we continue to have a problem. I have constant rows with the passive house people because by and large they still promote the use of plastic synthetic insulation. And I was delighted to see this brilliantly funny comment by Peter Rickaby recently about the zealotry of passive house. There are, of course, some passive houses which have been built with using natural materials, but they're very much the exception to the rule. So what about alternatives? I'm currently working on a new version of my 2006 book on natural building, and so I'm looking for good examples. I'm not quite sure about the one on the left here, but if anybody has really good projects that they'd like me to put into the book, I'd be really delighted to hear from them. One of the sections of the book will deal with this whole issue as to why natural materials and natural building is not taking off, and there was some very interesting discussion about this earlier in the morning. One of the things I think was particularly damaging was this report that was produced by the NHBC in 2014. It was based on an actually fairly good report by Tim Yates at the BRE, who's a good guy. But the NHBC issued a press release that led to these headlines: builders warned of risks with natural materials, hemp and straw, risky choices for new build homes. And I think this had a massively damaging effect. We also have problems with people in mainstream construction latching on to things like Hempcrete. So we've got the Swindon and Diss in Norfolk, where houses were built using so-called natural materials, but doing it in a really bad way. And so there's been a lot of damage done to the reputation of natural materials, and we haven't recovered from that. And in fact, a number of important businesses producing things like cellulose insulation went out of business as in my view, because of this. The other problem we've got is that we're still, even though we've built lots and lots of buildings out of things like hemp and clay and so on, it's still relatively a cottage industry, and we do have to find a way of bringing things like this more into the mainstream. I mean, there are many, many examples of buildings, particularly using Hempcrete, which is my particular interest, but it's still relatively underdeveloped. Though I have to say, in the last few months, I've had more inquiries from people in mainstream house building about using Hempcrete than I've had for quite some time. And of course, we have lots of wonderful examples. Some of you will be familiar with the Wise building. And Hempcrete in particular is extremely interesting for renovation. One of the projects I'm particularly proud of is the Rediscovery Centre in Dublin, in Ballymun, which is a conversion of an old boiler house. We tried to reuse as many of the existing materials as possible, and the walls here are insulated with Hempcrete, recycled sheet wool insulation, and also wood fibre. So we demonstrate this, and this is a building which can be visited by people, particularly school parties, to learn about methods of environmentally friendly building. One of the things that was discussed earlier is about training, and I spend quite a lot of my time doing training. We've run a series of workshops with the Hemp Cooperative in Ireland, and I've also worked with the Carbon Co-op in Manchester. Here's a couple of pictures of workshops that we've done where we get people to learn how to use these kinds of materials, and there's a lot more of this needs to go on. And also internationally, this is project that was done with Hempcrete in Kailicha in Cape Town, and I think that's Andy Horn on the right in that picture there. I've been involved in doing Hempcrete projects all over the world, though I think it's unlikely that I shall be burning more carbon flying around the world in the future. So really, to sum up, we don't have long to, this book was written 7 years to save the planet, was actually written 15 years ago. So that's a kind of interesting, and we're still talking about 7 years to save the planet. There's much to be done. I think we have to be battling with the dark side, with the chemical and plastics industry, and we need to be getting those materials out of buildings as much as possible. And we need to be campaigning for really zero, not just greenwash and fake news. So I'd be very happy to hear from anybody who's got anything to offer me for the next natural building book, and also if you're interested in joining in these kinds of activities. So thanks very much.